Oceanside City Council to order. We'll start with the Pledge of Allegiance, please. Ready? Begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We start with the roll call, please.
Mayor Weiss.
Here.
Deputy Mayor Feller. Councilmember Keim.
Here.
Councilmember Rodriguez.
We'll go to our first item, general item, which is the introduction and adoption of an urgency ordinance regarding moratorium on evictions. Mr. Mullen?
Mr. Mayor, I have a message. Councilmember Sanchez is trying to participate by phone. Do we have the phone available?
Oh, she does.
I'm sorry?
I didn't know she wanted to.
I just got that message right now. Do you want to take a 5-minute break while we try and figure that out? Okay, I'll give a brief presentation on the draft ordinance. So before you is the introduction and adoption of an urgency ordinance providing a temporary moratorium on residential and commercial evictions. This would last until May 31st, 2020. Because this is an urgency ordinance, it's adopted due to severe public health and safety concerns. State law requires that it pass by a 4/5 vote. The authority for this ordinance arises from Governor Newsom's Executive Order N-2820 that was issued last week. That order provides in relevant part, quote, any provision of state law that would preempt or otherwise restrict a local government's exercise of its police power to impose substantive limitations on residential and commercial evictions as described in subparagraphs 1 and 2 below, including but not limited to any such provision of Civil Code sections 1940 et sec and 1954.25 et sec is hereby suspended to the extent it would preempt or otherwise restrict such exercise. The draft ordinance in front of you provides temporary protection to both residential and commercial tenants. I have reviewed about approximately 20 or so ordinances that have been adopted or under consideration in other local agencies throughout the state. Some of these apply just to residential tenancies. The draft that's in front of you applies to both residential and commercial because the executive order allows it, first of all, and secondly, businesses are suffering just as their laid-off employees are. The ordinance prohibits evictions when the basis for the eviction is non-payment of rent arising out of a substantive decrease in household or business income, including but not limited to a substantial decrease in household income caused by layoffs or a reduction in the number of compensable hours worked, a substantial decrease in business income caused by a reduction in operating hours or consumer demand, or substantial medical expenses. The substantial decrease in household or business income or out-of-pocket medical expenses has to be caused by the COVID-19 pandemic or by any local, state, or federal government response to the pandemic. It also has to be documented. Finally, the tenant is required to notify the landlord in writing that the tenant has suffered a substantial decrease in household or business income or medical expense caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, provide the landlord with written documentation to support the claim, and pay that portion of the rent the tenant is able to pay. It's important to note that the tenant remains responsible for paying unpaid rent along with any applicable late fees set forth in the lease agreement. This is not an impairment of the landlord's contract. It merely temporarily limits one remedy available to the landlord for the tenant's non-payment through May 31st, 2020. That's the date the local governments are allowed to provide a moratorium under the governor's executive order. Submitted to you a revised ordinance electronically, and we've placed it on the city's website under today's agenda. That makes a couple relatively minor changes in response to public comments that we received in the last 24 hours. I'll go over those briefly. First, as I mentioned before, the tenant must notify the landlord prior to the rent due date. It was somewhat unclear when the tenant had to notify them. We've made a change to make it explicit that the tenant must notify the landlord prior to the rent being due. The tenant also, within 1 week of that notice, must provide objectively verifiable documents to show their inability to pay. The draft ordinance includes examples of that type of documentation that should be provided, including a letter from an employer providing a layoff or a reduction in hours, pay stubs, and where applicable, bank statements. Finally, if a tenant moves during the period covered by this ordinance, then rent would be otherwise due as specified in the lease. So those are the 3 changes that I've made and distributed to you. We've placed that on the city's website. Again, all in response to public comment that we've received in the last 24 hours. I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you. Mr. Navarro, how are we doing on the public side of things?
As of 1:30 today, I received 32 messages and 5 voicemails, with 11 in support and 21 with concerns. Our assistant city clerk just notified me that number is now 37 messages with 6 voicemails, and those have been distributed to council and will be made available on the agenda website of the city.
Thank you. Councilman Rodriguez?
Thank you very much. I appreciate our city attorney really taking the bull by the horns and putting a fair, very, very fair approach to this. We're in uncertain territory right now, and there's a lot going on. And as a city, we want to just protect businesses and protect residents. And also we want to protect landlords. So I would just like to say that I think this is a very fair ordinance. I think that it mitigates for families who are suffering. For example, if they're a restaurant employee and their restaurant's closed down, they don't have a paycheck coming in and they can't pay rent, and it stipulates clear criteria for those tenants in coordinating with their landlord. What this ordinance does not do is it does not say do not pay your rent. That is very important to convey. This is something that in your own unique circumstance as a business or as a tenant, to please read this ordinance clearly. It is posted on the City of Oceanside's website. And as we transition through this short period of time into recovery, I think this mitigates and protects all 3 sides: the landlords, the businesses, and the tenants. So I'm very, very happy to make a motion to approve this item today.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor Feller?
Thank you. Can you just elaborate a little bit, if you can, Mr. Mullen, the business owners and the effect that this kind of affects them as in the same way, but they have a little more protections out there from the state and the federal government at this point. So,
Yeah, and we could probably post on the city's website the resources that are available for property owners, landlords that may be subject to hardship as well. As I understand it, and I'm certainly not an expert in this yet, but the certain mortgages that are owned by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, as well as others that are insured by the FHA, there are programs that are being developed right now. And again, I think working with the city manager, we could put resources available on our city website that would provide some assistance to them.
What about business owners that are paying their mortgage to, or their rent to the landlord?
I'm sorry, the ordinance that's in front of you protects commercial tenants that are business owners. So local restaurants, for example, that had to close because of the county health orders, other local businesses that are having difficulty paying their rent, those are covered in this ordinance as well.
And it's covered, our protection, this ordinance covers that as well.
Yes, the moratorium on evictions applies to both commercial tenants and residential tenants.
All right. I second.
If we could, Mr. Mayor, if we could just clarify that the motion includes the waiver of the reading of the ordinance.
I believe that was part of the
I would like to
motion.
speak.
Councilmember Sanchez?
Thank you. I was waiting to see if anybody else was going to speak. But thank you very much for allowing me to do this via teleconference. First of all, this is how I thought the public was going to be able to participate. So I'm one of the reasons why I'm doing it this way is to see if this is some way that we can allow the public to participate. But as to what's before us, this is something that I requested last week during our meeting, our emergency meeting. I did ask about evictions and had received a lot of calls regarding from residents paying rent and who are losing their jobs, as well as businesses forced to close because they were considered non-essential. And so I'm really, really glad that we are coming today before to adopt this. I did have a question, though, with respect to Section 5. Nothing in this ordinance shall relieve a tenant of the obligation to pay rent, nor restrict a landlord's ability to recover rent due. The phrase, including applicable late fees, I was hoping that during this time period, a person who is not able to pay rent because of the loss of income due to the circumstances that we are in would excuse, or somehow that we would be able to allow for fees, late fees at least, to be waived. Is that something that we can do? Is that, Mr. Mullen, is that something that perhaps the governor's office gave direction to?
My advice is that we would really want to have statewide legislation on that issue and not act independently as a city on that matter. The goal of this ordinance really is to provide protection from evictions, but to not otherwise rewrite the lease agreements between the landlords and the tenants. Hopefully that will be done at a statewide level in the coming days.
Yeah, I wasn't. I'm actually not trying to rewrite the lease, except with respect to addressing the emergency situation that all of us, especially those that are renting, both commercial and residential, late fees could become actually even more than the actual rent amount. So I am concerned that we're not able to, or that we're not addressing that. That's the only thing here. I do agree that we're not here to excuse the payment of the rent, except that I am concerned about the late fees. One of the things that is happening statewide and countywide is that mortgage payments are being suspended, and late fees are not being requested. Same thing with taxes. Same thing with property taxes. Each agency is talking about not imposing late fees.
All right, well,
Can you speak to that, Mr. Mullins?
Yeah, that's, as I stated before, I think what the goal of this ordinance is to not rewrite or take any provisions of the lease agreement and make them not effective other than the eviction section. So if it were the council's direction to want to remove late fees, the section already says that nothing in there restricts the landlord's ability to recover rent that is due. If you want to leave it at that, I could live with that, but I think that's still going to leave it between the landlord and the tenant to determine if other fees are required.
Well, my comment to that would be, I would propose an amendment to the main motion that would be to strike out including applicable late fees, and hopefully as a community we'll be able to address this later.
Thank
Could have, if I may, Mr. Mayor, if it were acceptable to the council, we could just strike the words including applicable late fees. The section would then say nothing in the ordinance shall relieve a tenant of the obligation to pay rent, nor restrict a landlord's ability to recover rent due as set forth in a written lease agreement.
Deputy Mayor Feller?
The basis for this ordinance is to allow a little protection for a relatively short period of time, 2 months, of being evicted. So it doesn't relieve anybody. I'm sure their lease contract, which Mr. Mullen is talking about, has applicable late fees and all of those things in it already. There are compassionate property owners and landlords that will certainly take into consideration all of the things that we're trying to protect people from, but there's also people that'll take advantage of any opportunity, and so I think leaving it like it is respectable to both sides. They're given the opportunity. I think it's not our business to rewrite private contracts.
If I could speak one more time.
Well, hold on, Esther. I got other lights on. Councilman Rodriguez? And after Councilman Rodriguez's time, then we'll come back to you.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that Section 5, I read it as just a blanket statement that nothing in this ordinance is relieving a tenant of their obligations. And, you know, getting down into the fine detail of things, I think, is not our position. I think this is a civil matter that a landlord and a tenant will work out. Our involvement in this process needs to be as limited as possible. And I think it needs to be left alone, and I do not wish to modify my motion on this.
Councilman Kime?
So I think we are 10 days into this shelter in place, or actually a week into that, but really 10 days into this economy really slowing down. I think it would be wholly inappropriate to start rewriting leases on a grand scale right now. And that's not to say that I want people to pay applicable late fees. But with this, for me, the intent of this is to give people a breather, and this is about as complex of an issue as you can get. We have every different level that has to work together to make this successful. Banks, landlords, renters, and we're working on that. But to start rewriting leases in 10 days, I think sets a dangerous precedent, because we don't know what we're going to get right and what the answer is. None of us have done this before. So I think that's something that's very appropriate in the future. If you have a late fees caused by this, I think there's going to be action by the state and federal government to address that. But I think doing that as one city right now would be very inappropriate. It would set a dangerous precedent for that. But I'm happy we're doing this. I don't think anybody during this crisis needs to worry about having to get evicted, and that's what this is. And it gives us that time to really work it out. And I think we're getting to that direction. If you're watching what's happening across the country, we have banks that are providing this leeway, you know, the top 4 or 5, but not everyone has a mortgage of those top 4 or 5 banks. So this is going to legislation's happening in the Capitol right now, both capitals, Senate, or Washington and Sacramento. We had a conference call this morning with our state assembly member, a rep from Congressman Levin's office, and Supervisor Desmond's office, where we discussed these very things. So we are working on solutions that are in line, and it's a approach that covers every different level, and that's how we're going to be successful. Is everyone on the same page, working in the same direction? We just don't have that yet. So thank you.
Councilmember Sanchez?
Hello?
Councilmember Sanchez, you're up.
Thank you very much. I feel very strongly that those that are at most risk because of the economy and because of, losing jobs, are folks who are probably the most vulnerable. And it is very possible that landlords will use this as a pretext to evict people. So I am concerned about communities of color. I am concerned about anyone that is under a protected class, that they will use this to try to evict people. And I just don't think it's fair that everywhere else the model is to waive late fees, understanding that the funds, whatever is owed, is going to have to be paid. No one is saying we can't pay, we are not going to be able to pay our taxes, property taxes. No one is saying that. Nobody is saying, and I'm certainly not suggesting that we are waiving rent that is due. But I'm asking the council to consider that late fees can sometimes be even more than the actual rent due, and that we're talking about vulnerable communities, especially in Oceanside, one of the most diverse communities that is on the coast. So please consider this. I'm making a motion that we change the motion that is on the table and adopt what the city attorney has recommended.
Councilmember Keim?
I think I'm confused about some of the comments. This is to protect from evictions for everybody. So I don't think that's a worry. That's what we're doing, is we're protecting from evictions. And as I've stated, I would be very supportive of addressing the late fee issue, not 10 days into it, and we can address every part of it. We're going to have late tax fees. We're going to have, there's probably 100 things we're going to have to work out that I'm very supportive of. I think if we get out too fast and do it the wrong way, we're going to make mistakes. Right now, this protects people from eviction until the end of May. Is that correct, City?
Correct.
Okay, so that protects everybody till the end of May, and it gives us time to get this right.
It protects people until the end of May, and after that, we may be looking at massive evictions because people are not able to pay rent of 2 months all at once, 3 months if you're paying the rent for the following month, and then late fees. We're talking about possibly getting more people homeless on the streets. So I think that a simple resolution is to simply adopt what the city attorney has recommended, and then we can work from there. He is making that recommendation. He's not rewriting. He has indicated he's not rewriting anyone's lease agreement.
Well, doesn't appear to be a second to Councilmember Sanchez's motion, and we had a motion and a second on the original motion, which was to adopt as it is. Since we have Councilmember Sanchez on the phone, we will do a...
Mayor, I need to title the ordinance before you vote, if that's okay. Sorry to interrupt. Can I do that now? Sure. This is the introduction and adoption of an urgency ordinance of the City Council of the City of Oceanside providing a temporary moratorium on the eviction of residential and commercial tenants arising from the COVID-19 pandemic, as revised and distributed to the council on today's date.
So we'll do just a voice vote. So all in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed, nay.
I'm going to say nay to Section 5, specifically about including applicable late fees.
I don't know how you read. I guess it's still no.
So motion approved for 1 with Councilmember Sanchez voting no on Section 5 regarding late fees.
So on item 2, do we have any public?
There are no public comments on item number 2.
Then we will be adjourning to a mayor council workshop at 2 o'clock on Wednesday, April 1st for planning commissioner appointments. We are adjourned.